What's up, guys? Ice Cold Outdoors here. Today we are talking about deer movement in wind. Does it have an effect? There was a comment on a video I posted a couple of days or weeks ago, and it was somebody that mentioned that buck actually move more in higher winds, and buck specifically as opposed to doe. So I took a look at the study, read through the data. Not surprisingly, I have some qualms with it. I have some issues, and there's one glaring one I want to get to at the end. But there's a little bit background here we'll go through first. We'll go through the data of the study. We'll go through everything there, the origin and how long it had continued. And then from there, I'll go through what I think is maybe a shortcoming of the data or the data gathering. So this is a study that started in Penn State University along with a couple other adjoining universities, is what it sounded like when I was reading it. In October of 2013, Leah Goralico of Penn State started gathering data on deer and categorizing wind movement. It was later continued in 2015, and I believe another year, and written about by Jessica Hepner. And that was done in October, like I said, of 2015, and then October of another year. So all three iterations of this study were done in October in 3 separate years. So what did Leah and Jessica find? They found that by the end of it, largely from Jessica's data, because Leah's data only went up to 12 miles per hour. There were no winds recorded above 12 miles per hour in October of 2013 for her study. I think that's a shortcoming, and I think that's why Jessica later continued or wrote about the continued data gathering for the later years, because after looking up the average wind in Philadelphia, at least from the airport, because they gathered this data, the average wind in October for Philadelphia, and I'm going to use Pennsylvania City because it's Penn State University, the average wind was 8.8. So the average was 8.8 miles per hour in October in Philly. And Leah in 2013 only gathered winds up to 12 miles per hour top. So right there, that's really not much above the average, and I think that's a shortcoming. So then later when Jessica did the study, they did categorize the wind into 3 categories. They did light, moderate, and heavy winds, and they categorized the activity of both male and female across those 3 wind levels. Now, they did also take into effect categories of rain versus no rain. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to focus just on the wind, but that data is there, and we can look at that simultaneously because it's overlaid on the same graph. So I'm going to be focusing on the wind aspect of it. What did Jessica find and Leah find on buck and doe? For doe, whether it's rain or not, the wind level, it's almost flat. Seems like the doe are not terribly influenced by the wind level. There was one thing that they noted, which is the wind activity at night is lower from doe. That's likely, if I had to guess, and they do acknowledge this in the study, that's likely because the doe's traveling with her fawn. If the fawns are out at night, they may be easily preyed upon by a coyote or two, or a mountain lion, or whatever type of nighttime predators there are, depending on the geography. So that is one thing to note. Now, the buck correlation to wind seems to increase the activity along with the wind in a direct relationship, meaning the more wind there is, the more buck activity there is. I do have some qualms with this study. I do have some qualms with some of the data that I think is misleading in the representation of deer activity that shows from a result of this study. So let's start at the top. This is an observational study, right? Experimental would be if Leah and Jessica and Penn State, I'm just going to say Penn State, I don't know how many other people were involved besides Leah and Jessica, so I'll say Penn State. Penn State is not able to control the weather. An experimental study would be if Penn State could take the deer that they had to study and was able to change the wind levels to see if that would then lead to increased deer activity. Instead, what they did was they were only able to observe whatever level of wind there is, how much activity was happening at that time. So that's a correlation, right? We know in science correlation is not equal causation. So even though buck and wind might be directly correlated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are causing the increased deer activity. So that's point number one. Now, making an experimental study of this, unless you can control the weather, is not going to happen. So every study that we get on this is going to be an observational study. Like I mentioned before, this was done in October 2013, October 2015, and October of one other year. The time of the study, I think, is very important. This is possibly what I think is the biggest shortcoming of this study. If we're going to study the deer activity in October, we as hunters, what's the one thing that's coming in October that we are getting ready for? The rut. So we have the pre-rut and the early rut cycle coming into effect in mid to late October. That is going to naturally drive deer activity. So to say, well, we've seen increased activity on windier days in October, I would argue that the latter days of the month, as we get further into the fall and closer to winter, that the wind naturally picks up. And so the wind is naturally more at the later end of the month, which is also when we're getting into the pre-rut and early rut cycles and the deer activity is naturally picking up. So again, the correlation between those windier days and that deer activity specifically with the buck is not necessarily because of the wind. I think if you truly want to break this study down, what you have to look at is you have to look at wind January through December. Look at the wind in all parts of the year and say, on the windier days, are the deer traveling more? If they're traveling more, is it only during October and November when they're catching scent of a female in heat, if they know that there's a doe in heat nearby? Or is it wind even in March or April or May when they're in their spring, summer months? That wind will still drive their activity, right? So that's a big thing to take note of. Again, correlation is not equal causation, but to say that deer are more active on windier days when you're taking data only from October, when activity for the deer and specifically the buck is increasing because they're starting to chase those doe, I think that's cherry picking data and may or may not support your argument. You really have to take data across the whole year and look at each month and even break it down by that. Deer Lab had put up an article with this study referenced, and he shared that he had seen he said not significantly, but noticeably higher activity with deer on windier days, specifically among buck. And so that may be true, but if you ask me my anecdotal experience, I hunt, one of the places that I hunt in Maryland, you can hunt over corn in Maryland. So where I hunt in Maryland, there's deer that come in the corn, both this way and this way into where the corn is. So what does that look like on a windy day though? They don't come straight in. They usually only come in from the one side. That might just be them playing the wind, trying to gather smells, whatever. It might just be the lay of the land and how the geography played out. But instead of just coming straight in and walking in, still an alert, they're doing this, in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, trying to make sure that anything that they think they hear or smell or see isn't just the leaves rustling in the wind, isn't just the branches blowing in the wind. they're trying to make sure that they are still safe to come in and eat some of that corn. So on the windier days, I only saw doe and fawn. No buck came in. That's my anecdotal experience. That doesn't mean the buck aren't up and moving around. They very well could be. This study shows that they do cover more ground. Now, whether or not that's quality movement, that's what I want to take a look at here. Because right now, just from my anecdotal experience, yeah, that doe and fawn that came in, that do the zigzag in, they're probably covering 2, maybe even 3 times as much ground in terms of meters traveled. But is that better for me as a hunter if their net distance traveled is still the same? Net distance, right? They start at point A, end at point B. This is the net distance. But their total distance, if they do a zigzag, could be 2, 3, even more times as high, because they're not going in a straight line. They're not taking the most direct route. So that's one thing to note there. So how do we define active? Well, in this study, the units measured is meters per hour. That's how they're defining activity. So if we're going to take a look at the one of the midpoints for the charts there was about 50 meters per hour. And what I'm assuming they did is they took the total distance of a deer traveled in a day and divided it by the 24 hours in the day. I couldn't find exactly how they broke down that data, but I did find their end result, which is the roughly 50 meters per day, give or take, depending on how high or low on the curve you're going. So if you take, this is rough math, but if it's 1,000 meters traveled over 24 hours, that's roughly 50 meters. It's a little less, but roughly 50 meters per hour. So if they just say, well, this deer traveled 1,000 meters today in a 24-hour span, that brings us 50 meters per hour, that may be true. But again, if he's traveling between his bed and his food, and he's doing this, as opposed to on a normal day he's doing this, is that more active? I would argue, unless your tree stand is already between the bed and the food, it's really not going to play out that much better for you. In fact, it may play out worse. Specifically, if you bedded down and then traveling a lot of distance at once, and then rebedding when he thinks he's safe, and then traveling again, and then rebedding, and he's traveling 300 meters at a time, and he does that 3 times in the day, to take him to 900 meters traveled total, well, that's most of his traveling there is just him thinking he sees or hears or smells something and spiking up that distance and taking off and rebedding somewhere else. And if a deer's running because he thinks he's in danger, that's not very good for me as a hunter, specifically a bow hunter, because I can't hit a deer running in high wind. Deer, I mean, he'll be in and out of my line of sight in 2-3 seconds, and that's if it's a clearing. If it's through the woods, he's gone in less than that. So just saying, well, he traveled more in a 24-hour span, instead of having them take the averages and produce that data as the result of the study, what I would be curious to see is, what does it look like throughout the day? And then if you could even gather too, right, you would do, this is time and this is the meters in distance traveled. You start at 12 a.m. midnight and go to 12 a.m. midnight the next day. Well, let's say that he didn't do the sprinting and he didn't just take off and rebed and take off and rebed. If you could travel or track his travel between midnight to midnight, well, this would be about noon. Is he traveling more during the day? And also, was it windier during the day? Was he traveling more during the high winds? They did break down the total travel versus day and night, but I would be curious to see how much did he travel during the high winds, because if there's gusts of wind that are picking up, between midnight to noon, and then it calms down in the latter half of the day and his travel looks like this, it looks relatively unbothered. But if there's high wind in the morning and then it calms down during the afternoon and his travel looks like this, well, then he's bedded down during the high winds and he's moving when it's not. And obviously the opposite would be true for this, right? That's a lot of distance traveled during that high wind, and then he's bedded down during the calm time. So that's something to note as well. So I'd be curious to see the raw data of distance traveled versus the averages that they put out. Just because the averages for those higher wind days are higher doesn't necessarily mean they're traveling during the higher winds. I guess they're assuming in this study that the wind continued all throughout the day, which may or may not be true. So, a couple qualms with this study. Again, the biggest one is the time of the study. If you're going to study in just October and say that there's a correlation between the windier days and the buck activity, that may be true, but you're not accounting for one of the biggest drivers of buck activity throughout the whole year, which is the rut. And they're starting to enter that time. And I would argue that that's happening as you're getting later into the fall and winter, which is going to be a windier time frame. So to find correlation between that doesn't necessarily, to me, mean that the wind is going to help drive deer or specifically buck activity. Now, I do think if you're hypothesizing that the deer are bedded down entirely during windy days and they don't ever get up, I do think this holds water saying that that's probably not true. Now, that graph that I just showed you from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m., that would be probably the most indicative of how much are they really traveling. I would want to see, is it just a couple spikes in terms of activity, or is it continuous throughout the day on those windy days? That, I think, would be more important if you had to argue it. So, does this mean this is a bad study? No, but there are some significant shortcomings of this study. Penn State, I think, if we want to branch outside of October, then, and we see similar correlations, then maybe that argument of deer travel during high winds holds a little bit more water. I think I would be inclined to adapt that philosophy a little bit more if I did see it outside of October, and if they expanded it beyond October and November, because the mating season, all bets are off. That's an all bets are off scenario, because they're so driven by the mating that they're not going to be as pressured by the wind. We all know, you can see buck getting careless during the rut. They're out midday. They're chasing. They lose up to 30% of their body weight just chasing these doe. A 200-pound deer can go down to 140 pounds, losing 60 pounds over the course of the month from just chasing doe and prioritizing the mating and the breeding over their own self-preservation in terms of right food and fattening up for the winter. So that is huge. That's a big driving factor for these deer. You can't take wind levels at this time and say that this is what I think is, correlated with the higher activity. I don't think that's fair. So what I would really think would be more impactful would be a wind study across all 12 months of the year. In short, I don't think this necessarily shows that deer are traveling more, or at least not getting you better opportunities as a hunter, and again, specifically a bow hunter, with higher winds. I don't think that's necessarily opening more doors for you, just from what I'm seeing here from this study. I could be wrong. If you guys have other studies that you want to reference, please drop it in the comments. I'll be happy to take a look at it. I can do a review as well. If you have another study just not related to wind and you want to just have me break down what that study is saying about deer and how it interacts with what you're interpreting from the data or what the data seems to be showing, please let me know. Drop it in the comments. If you have a link, that's really helpful. I will be happy to take a look at it. And if there's anything that I missed for this Penn State study, please drop it in the comments as well. I'll be happy to follow it up there as well. In the meantime, continue to hunt safe and enjoy your time outdoors. Guys, hope you get a big one.